Shall we start here?
Good morning. Welcome to ATCM YouTube channel, and today we have a panel discussion, as we have already informed, on acute stroke management. For the same, we have all familiar faces with us. To start with, our beloved head of the Department of Emergency Medicine, Dr. Girish Kumar sir, Dr. Vivek Nandiya sir, who is a head of stroke division at Amrita Institute of Medical Sciences, and my colleague Dr. Sri Krishnan, who is a consultant in emergency medicine. Today in the discussion, we will be limiting ourselves to predominantly acute ischemic stroke. And as you all know, stroke is a major burden, both in terms of mortality and morbidity worldwide. And to have a very comprehensive discussion within 1.5 hours is near to impossible. So we will be limiting it to certain key questions, covering certain basics, and then the kind of bit of controversial topics also. But we'll be covering it over like next 1.5 hours with few pre-planned questions, and then we will be moving on to take audience questions. And let's start. I'll start with an initial question to Vivek sir. Sir, as a stroke physician, can you just give us some insight into what age group, and is there any kind of a gender predominance in stroke cases you are seeing in our part of the world?
As we all know, acute ischemic stroke, and for that matter, all the strokes are more common in the elderly. But recently, we can see, if you look into the statistics, especially in the Asian countries, in Asian ethnicity, we can see a little bit more of a young age group getting into stroke. We mean young stroke by less than 45 years or less than 50 years in some of the definitions. So one of the reasons for this is the real change in the economy and the pattern of lifestyle changes. Means they are more sedentary, and there is more affluence and more substance abuse, or alcoholism, smoking. All those things are causing this. So if you look into the stroke scenario, the young stroke is more common in the Asian population because of several factors. One thing is, as I mentioned, the lifestyle disease, which is more common, and that we can modify. And the second part is the certain amount of genetic predisposition to certain risk factors. For example, there are certain genetic polymorphisms which will make a person more prone to stroke, like hypertension. We know several genetic polymorphisms. These are common in Asians. So, and also there are a few other things, just like certain diseases, as you may have heard of Moyamoya disease, you may have heard of intracranial atherosclerotic disease. These things are more common in Asians compared to the Caucasians. So in general, stroke is a disease of the older generation, like more than 60 years or more than 55 years, but it is slightly more common in the Asian population in the younger group. For example, less than in India, for example. If you look into the different epidemiological studies, we can see the stroke in the young people is around 10 to 12%, which is comparatively high in compared to the Caucasian population, where the stroke is around 2 to 5%. So this is a double the amount of young stroke which is happening in the Western world. So that's a matter of concern, and so that we should be aware of these symptoms. We very much pushing to develop the stroke units, stroke care systems, and stroke awareness in the public.
And the second part, gender predominance, anything you are seeing?
Gender predominance, as of now, what we see, the stroke is more common in the males because of several associated risk factors. However, after a certain age, like more than 50, especially in the post-menopausal age group, the stroke is all that proportion. Even though proportion of the males are more, that gap, the disparity is slowly coming down. That is one of the reason is that we know that the vascular risk factors and the event of the protection of the estrogen in the female sex and gender will come down. So basically that may be one of the reasons. And one interesting point is that the gender preferences, if the female get a stroke after a certain age, the mortality and morbidity is slightly high compared to the males.
I think that very much clears the first question. Moving on to Dr. Sri Krishnan. Krishnan, what are the major symptoms to look out for in any patient who is coming to ER and to suspect stroke?
Thank you, Shabrish, for that introduction. So, the most important thing that we need to remember when you say any symptoms can be that of a stroke. When you just quickly liquidate. But you have to understand what are the common symptoms that why the patient will come to the ED, or maybe they come to a pre-hospital setup. So we can easily remember with the mnemonic FAST.
Yeah.
So any F for face, arm,
Okay.
speech, and T is for again time. So face, arm, speech, and time is
Yes.
very crucial. That is a priority that we need to understand. And the most important thing that they will come in will be a minor facial deviation.
Okay.
Maybe they woke up in the morning, they are able to see a minor facial deviation. So that is the one thing that very concerning. Maybe they have gone to brush the teeth, they are seeing some facial deviation. That can be the initial sign. And maybe during brushing, they find some difficulty in their hands, weakness of their upper limb, or maybe minor lower limb. That will be the subtle signs that can be easily picked up. And again, any difficulty in speaking. And any difficulty in speaking as such, they will not be able to clearly say what exactly. Maybe they will difficult to comprehend. Maybe they have difficulty to articulate. What exactly they will not be able to say, but they will have some difficulty in speaking. So the most important thing will be a facial deviation, weakness of the arm, and speaking difficulty. That is the easiest thing that you need to understand. And any of these symptoms is that you need to consider stroke as your first differential diagnosis. This is in a nutshell. This will be the common features. Any limb weakness, followed by a facial weakness, followed by difficulty in speech. That's a common, and there can be lot of variations, like they can come with syncope, they can come with dizziness, they can come with lot of other mimics and chameleons are there, which I think we'll be discussing in the coming session. The most important thing is that these are the common symptoms by which they come into the ED, and the most importantly, if you take a clear-cut history, maybe you can go ahead and you can even locate exactly where the lesion is, if you are able to do a good clinical examination. But as the time is very less for an acute stroke management, we are not asking for all those things in an ED. What we can identify the stroke immediately. So any of the difficulty in speaking, facial deviation, or arm drift, or speaking difficulty, you identify that it can be probably a stroke, and you activate your stroke team, and you go ahead with your stroke protocol management. We have a workflow for a stroke flow in our hospital. So we need to activate that, and we need to go step by step so that we will not miss an acute stroke. As we know, the time is the crucial. 3 to 4.5 hours is the maximum time that we will get for an acute stroke for thrombolysis. So we will not miss the time, and within 20 minutes they should be pushed into an imaging facility. So this will be the common symptoms.
So all students and everyone listening there, always remember the mnemonic FAST for early detection of stroke. Moving on to the next question, Krishna already touched upon it on stroke mimics and chameleons. Girish, can you just explain what do you mean by stroke mimics and chameleons?
So when we are working in emergency room, we have a lot of cases coming to emergency room with the different presentations.
Okay.
Now we are discussing about stroke, but other conditions which can present like stroke, they are mimics, or stroke presenting like other conditions. But stroke is there. Due to some reason, the presentation is different. That is chameleons. First, we will discuss about stroke mimics. One of the most important investigation we do in emergency room is glucometer, finger prick test for glucose. That is the first investigation we do almost every patient who is having altered behavior. Many patients who is having hypoglycemia can present like stroke. Almost all different types of stroke presentation can be seen in hypoglycemic patient. Once we correct that, immediately patient improves, that weakness will completely disappear. And hyperglycemia also sometimes can present like stroke, but that is not exactly like hypoglycemia. Their correction may take time because the hypercoagulability of blood may take some time to correct, and they also can present like stroke. One of the most important thing. Next one is again neurological problem we take, like patient had seizure, outside patient had seizure, and seizure is subsided, patient come with paralysis, one side paralysis. It's called as Todd's paralysis. It may remain for some time. Some patients recover very fast. That also can present like stroke. We initially, if we don't know the history, we may think that it's a stroke. So that can be there. And again, some patients who have syncopal attack. Ideally, syncope by definition, patient falls down, immediately patient regains consciousness, there is no confusion, there is no weakness. But if we don't get proper history, we know that only patient fallen down. But patient could not give proper history. Bystander tells patient fallen down. Again, we may misdiagnose it as stroke. Patients who had complete heart block or patient who had arrhythmia, they also can present like stroke. And any infection like encephalitis, meningitis, all these patients can also have stroke-like features. So all these things can be stroke mimics. Again, inner ear problems like patient who is having
tinnitus, vertigo. We may misdiagnose it as posterior circulation stroke. So all these things can be a chameleon also. Somebody who come with encephalitis or meningitis,
Okay.
but he can definitely have
yeah,
a stroke
stroke
also,
also.
because meningitis can be associated with vascular changes, and he can present with stroke. Or somebody is having a stroke who develops an aspiration pneumonia, who
Can
come
present
with,
with- okay,
present with an
Aspiration
infection.
pneumonia, yeah.
So that can be a chameleon.
Okay,
Again, high BP. Patient may present with slightly altered behavior. High BP. We may think that the BP is producing all the problem. It may not. It may be on the other side that patient is developed stroke, and to protect the penumbra, BP has slightly increased. So we may again misdiagnose. Stroke can present with seizures also.
Okay.
So all these things are chameleons. We may misdiagnose it as something else. We may go in that track. We may miss the stroke path. So all these things are very important in emergency. When we are practicing in emergency room, these things are very important, because we may be practicing as a single physician. We may be working in emergency room. So if we don't have a good idea about all these things, we can easily miss stroke, which is a very important diagnosis, because once we diagnose, a stroke team can immediately come and they can treat the patient in a better way. But suppose we are not able to diagnose this, and we cannot blame them, because we are not diagnosing it, we are not picking it, we are not referring at right time. So this knowledge is very important in emergency room.
Okay, got it, sir. And stroke mimics and chameleons is also a very favorite question for vivas and other examinations also. So I'm sure students will make a note of it. Moving to Krishna, another key component in management of stroke is the NIHS score. So can you just elaborate on what it is and how to use it?
Okay. So again, the NIHS score is when you discuss regarding stroke, that is one, we should have a uniform language. So suppose I want to refer a patient, I want to consult Vivek sir. Sir, a patient has come to the ED with this NIHS score. So he quickly gets an idea what exactly is the patient weakness, what is the severity of the stroke. That is the first information that we'll get from doing an NIHS
So
score.
basically it's a score.
It is a
numeric
scoring
score.
system. It is a National Institute of Health Sciences scoring system
Okay.
developed for. It was a study done, and later found out that it has been very useful.
Yeah.
And we have been using it for all acute stroke cases coming to the ED. And we have got 11 parameters in it. We'll take the best gaze response, motor response, all those things what we need to look into. There are 11 components, and we'll get a score out of it. And maximum score is 42. Again, it is, each one has got components, and then again it is divided from 0 to 4. Certain from 0 to 3, and some from 0 to 4 it is divided. 0 there is no deficit, and 4 it is the maximum deficit, just like our GCS scoring. So we have made 11 parameters, and we are getting a score out of this. So by getting the score, what is the major use? I said it forms a uniform language. That is number one. You know the severity of the stroke. Then the next thing is that again you are giving some treatment. What is happening to the patient after that? Maybe the initial score was something like 15. After your initial treatment, it has improved. After maybe 24 to 40, you know that okay, this patient has improved after your treatment. And again, it is a predictor also for the mortality. When you see that the NIHS score is increasing more than 16, again if it is more than 25, again it is a very high chance of mortality we can predict. What the studies have shown that above 16, for every increase of one score, there is an increase in that much rate of mortality also. And again, if it is less than 6, there is a high chance of early recovery also. So that is a one major factor that we can understand: severity of the score, prognostication of the patient, and to communicate and for a diagnosis help, it will be very useful. And it's a very simple test, bedside test, which can be maybe you need a few days of training, maybe a couple of cases. If you do that, we can easily
And
do
you
the
can always
NIHS.
have a chart or something.
Have a chart. It is very difficult to remember all these parameters in an without looking into any paper. It is 11. You can have a printout. We have taken a printout, and we are keeping it the case sheet, and also we have Android mobile apps available for this. So you can just calculate, and we'll get a reading. And again, as you say, if it is less than 5 or less than 4, the stroke is minor, and those group of patients may not recover, may not need an IV thrombolytic therapy. So as the score increases like above 15 up to maybe 25, we can think in terms of it's a severe stroke, but still those group of patients are having benefit of giving thrombolysis. So between a stroke score between around 15 to 25, maybe we can think about thrombolysis. If it's the letter score less than 60, the chance of complications and again is very less. So that is a quick bedside scoring system that can be done maybe 2 to 3 minutes. We can do at the bedside, and we can come to a conclusion. I think Vivek sir agrees, sir.
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, about 25, again the indication for thrombolysis, we generally think twice before giving a thrombolysis if the scores goes above 25. Chance of bleeding chances and hemorrhagic transformation increases.
Okay, okay. I think that made it very, very clear. Moving on to Vivek sir. So one key thing which we always emphasize on is the time of onset of symptoms for stroke. So a lot of the treatment strategies will based upon that specific question. And also, can you just, along with that, can you just answer the question of what is wake-up stroke also?
So one thing which you have to understand, if the basic pathophysiology of stroke is either you are getting an artery ruptured or there is an occlusion of the block of the artery. That's called ischemic stroke and hemorrhagic stroke. So we are talking about ischemic stroke. So what is the basic pathophysiological thing happening when there is an arterial occlusion? So when the artery is occluded, we all know that brain is the most energy consuming organ in the body, requiring lot of circuits to be activated for managing or controlling the body systems. So when the oxygen supply and the blood supply and the glucose is less to the brain, naturally there will be initial thing which is going to happen is a membrane failure or electrical failure, which means the sodium potassium ATPase pump will be less functioning and it will stop functioning. So that will result in poor generation of the electrical impulses and you will get the symptoms, because there is an electrical failure which will correspond to the symptom. So, but the tissue is not dead. So, if you really go hard and work on it and open the blood vessel when there is an electrical failure only, you will really completely reperfuse the tissue and will bring back to the function. So, that is, time is important. So, that is why when the ischemia time prolongs, so this membrane changes, the electrical dysfunction will go to a structural dysfunction.
Yes.
We all know the ischemic changes at a cellular level, the entry of calcium, the failure of the potassium, the sodium potassium pump at the membrane level, entry of calcium, release of the sarcolemmal enzymes and causing necrosis. That is what ischemic necrosis is. So our overall goal here in treating stroke is to reduce the time to reperfuse the ischemic area. So that is why time is important. So then how will you judge the time? That is the one question. So the time, like there are two types. One is a witnessed onset stroke. So that's very clear. You have seen somebody who was talking to you, suddenly there is facial deviation, very gargly speech, and you identify that is the onset time. Sometimes somebody go to bed at 10 p.m. in the night and you are seeing him with stroke falling out of bed and with hemiplegia and not able to communicate, aphasia. So that is called wake up stroke. So here wake up stroke, actually we will take, there are two times, that is a time last seen normal. So last seen normal was when he went to bed at 10 p.m. Now at the time of waking up, he is having stroke. So that is wake up stroke. So here there will be a little bit difficulty in determining the time. Here we may have to use advanced imaging, all those things, or MRI, CT. So we will come to that to identify the time. So the witnessed onset time and last seen normal, these are the two important times, because we have time limited or time intensive treatment for reperfusion of the brain.
Okay. I think that's a very, very important aspect of management of acute stroke. Again, to the audience, thank you all for joining us, and please give your questions or put your questions in the chat box. We'll be taking it at the end of the session. Next question is to Girish sir. Sir, ECG is one thing which people usually ignore in acute stroke management. Is there anything to look forward in ECGs in acute stroke?
So when we are discussing about ECG, we can divide that into two compartments. One is ECG changes seen in stroke. Other one is ECG which can predict a disease producing stroke. Both are different. Like atrial fibrillation, multifocal atrial tachycardia, or atrial flutter, SVT. All these conditions, or ischemic heart disease, all these conditions can present with stroke due to a pathology in the heart or in the blood vessel. That is one part. So always look for any ECG changes which is present previously or which is present acutely at present also should be looked at. Main thing is atrial fibrillation. So atrial fibrillation, why patient is developing stroke, everyone know that. There will be intramural thrombus that is producing ischemic stroke. Ischemic heart disease also sometimes can present with strokes, because one part of the ventricular atrium is not contracting properly. There clots will form and that can produce a stroke. So that is one part. Other part is ECG changes in stroke.
That's secondary to stroke.
They are not very important for a physician who is managing stroke, because he is managing stroke. He is not bothered about the ECG changes. But in emergency room, these are very important, because when the patient come with altered behavior or some minor stroke-like feature, we are taking an ECG. We see deeply inverted T waves. Normally, a physician, emergency physician will misdiagnose it as acute coronary syndrome, and they go in that track. But the patient has developed a stroke that has produced the ECG changes. If we know that, then the stroke part will be treated well, and this part can be ignored.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that, most important changes are, one is deeply inverted TIVO,
Okay.
ST depression, ST elevation,
Okay.
and prolonged QT. These are the 4 important findings you can get in a stroke case. In that, ST elevation or ST depression has got a bad prognosis in stroke cases.
Okay.
Whatever it is, if the patient coming in a like that window period, golden hours,
Okay.
if we thrombolize, the prognosis can be still better.
Okay.
All these things are studied previously when there was no such thrombolytic therapies available. That data still we are following.
Okay.
But we are not followed what is a newer data. What happens even if there is ST elevation or ST depression, if we thrombolyze, what is the outcome? That studies have not come properly.
Yeah.
So all these ECG changes are associated with bad prognosis depending on the previous data. Whatever it is, these changes we are seeing.
Okay.
But deeply inverted T wave, one of the most common finding what we are seeing in stroke cases.
Okay.
But what is the most important thing is atrial fibrillation. That is the most important thing, because we have to treat the stroke part and atrial fibrillation part both together.
Okay.
Whereas other part, stroke, we have to manage only stroke.
Okay. Okay.
So this knowledge is very important in emergency room.
Okay.
So we should learn that.
Clear, sir. Now, moving on to Vivek, sir, the $1,000,000 question. Is it CT or MRI for acute stroke? And is the decision more based upon the institutional capabilities, or is there any other factors influencing such a decision?
So I think one thing which we have to remember in this situation is management of stroke, the principle is time is brain.
Okay.
So we have discussed about the time of onset. Everywhere we are discussing time. Why time is important? As we know, if you reperfuse early, the brain will be functional and patient will be back to previous levels. So I don't think it is very important to do CT or MRI, whatever it is. The thing is, you have to do without loss of time.
Okay.
So for acute reperfusion therapy, if the CT is available, you can go for CT angiogram, and along with CT, it will be better to do CT angiogram also, because the time for taking a CT is hardly less than a minute, and for time for taking a CT angiogram is also less than a minute.
Okay.
So if we can do CT angiogram together, it will be much faster. And MRI is a better technology, but it will be time consuming. For patients whom we are intending to treat acutely, like a patient in a very early window, we do not want to do an MRI generally.
Okay.
Because if you can save time and give thrombolysis to the patient, that patient will be benefited, because average time for an MRI scan for a stroke patient is about 10 to 20 minutes. So for CT it is about 1 to 2 minutes. So basically, and also the movement artifact, all those things are more with MRI, and also there can be contraindications, there can be pacemakers, implants, all other things. So basically, the imaging of, suppose in a scenario in your institution, suppose MRI is only available or CT is out of order, you go for MRI. So this is highly depending upon the workflow you design at your institution. If you got ready MRI for neurology or stroke, you can do that MRI. But generally, we will try to reduce the imaging time. We will try to reduce complicated or very detailed imaging at the time of ischemic stroke in the early window, in the golden window. In the golden window, we have to save the time. If it is out of window, we would go for advanced imaging. So in short, it is not the modality of imaging is important, it is the time by which you can do it, so that we can re-establish the blood flow in the blocked arteries.
That very much clears the key question. But does the MRI have any advantage over CT in identifying things, or
Definitely. If I told you the same point, like if it is in the window, and if your diagnosis of stroke is not very sure, for example, you are seeing a young lady who is having a quarrel with the husband, and suddenly she become hemiplegic and she is not moving at all, and there is no facial deviation. So your clinical suspicion of stroke is much less. Like you don't think it is a stroke, it could be functional or something like that, where you think it's hypoglycemia. In those situations, it will be better to go for an MRI. But in a patient whom you clinically think stroke is the most likely diagnosis, you can go for time saving imaging. So MRI has got n number of advantages over CT. It will give you a definite diagnosis of stroke by variable sequences like diffusion imaging and ADC mapping. You can definitely say that there is a tissue damage. You can have angiogram without contrast in MRI, that also give good amount of information. And also you can time the you can determine the timing of the stroke by comparing different modalities of MRI. Like if you look into the FLAIR images, if the FLAIR images are showing white area in the infarction, that is you know the basic imaging which determines the infarction is diffusion, and also there is a FLAIR image, and if diffusion is showing white bright area and FLAIR is showing white area, which means the infarction is more than 4.5 hours,
Okay.
which means that particular patient is out of window for thrombolysis of 4.5 hours. So that means the stroke has happened a little bit early than as we have expected.
Yeah.
These type of things, timings are not very well possible in the CT scan.
Yeah.
However, there are certain things which can be looked into plain CT scan. That is called aspect scoring. That is a scoring system which is used for understanding the early CT changes in the brain by comparing the opposite side. So that is just looking into the areas which have been scored into 10, and you look at the changes in the CT, development of hypodensity or swelling, and you compare with the opposite side. And if you get an aspect score of the acute stroke patient, you see the aspect score is more than 7, it's a good scan. And if the aspect score is less than 5, it's a bad scan. So in a bad aspect score scan, even if you thrombolize, the outcome may be bad. So this could be a very well utilized system for emergency medicine physicians and basic doctors, so that they can learn aspect. Where I was trained in Calgary, those people developed the aspect system, and there is a website for getting trained into aspect, www.aspect.com. So you can go to that and you can train yourself. That's a very useful tool which you can learn, and just plain CT at the initial point will tell how the stroke will go, whether the stroke will respond to treatment or not, but it requires a little bit of training.
Okay. So again, to all viewers, we have already mentioned about 2 scores. Krishna initially mentioned about the NIHS score, and now sir spoke about the aspect score. So I request all of you to, after the session, to go through it today itself and make a note of these 2 things. And I'm sure we are getting into a few more scores as the day progresses. Moving on to Krishna. Krishna, no discussion on stroke will be over without talking about TIA, transient ischemic attack. So if you can tell us some basic concepts of TIA, and is an event of TIA an indicator of future strokes?
Yes. So again, TAA, we have all learned what exactly is TAA. Within 24 hours time, that is a classical definition. If the patient's deficit, everything disappears, we can call it as a TAA. That is the definition that we have learned. But in an ED physician, a patient is coming with you, sudden onset of weakness. So you are evaluating him. We doesn't know whether it is exactly a TAA, whether it is a stroke. So we are in the dilemma phase. So maybe after coming to the ED, maybe after 15 to 20 minutes, you have written everything, you have calculated your NIHS score, and suddenly when you are shifting for the imaging, the patient is telling, I don't have any weakness at this point. So that will be the classical history that we might get in the emergency room. So if the TAA that is going to improve, the definition wise it is 24 hours, but usually if it has to improve, it will improve within the early phase itself. Maybe within the 1 or 2 hours, that is a maximum that the TAA will improve. As the definition is different, but the clinical definition what we need to look into is this. So when the patient is in your ED and you are evaluating him, and at that time within the 20 minutes, that's the time that we say that the patient should be shifted for an imaging facility. During that time the symptoms improves, that we can consider this as TAA. So TAA as such, you can have weakness, you can have the classical amaurosis fugax. It is coming as a TAA, maybe just an upper limb weakness, maybe a speaking difficulty, a sudden slurring of speech. After some time the patient is improved. So that will be the clinical features by which we will see. But again the dilemma comes after 20 minutes, what we should do for this patient, whether we should proceed with an imaging, whether we should admit this patient, whether we should start him on an aspirin. So again, for that reason, we can quickly do is the ABCD2 score. So that is a one easy score that we can do in the emergency room. So it is basically a very simple scoring system where you are considering the age of the patient, whether the blood pressure of the patient, BP if it is above 140/80, age more than 60 years. Again, the clinical features, whether it is limb weakness is there, what is the duration of the limb weakness, whether there is any speaking difficulty. Again, the weakness is more than 2 hours. Again, it has got an increased score, and the weakness has improved within 1 score, it has less score, and weakness improving within 1 minute, again it has score less score. And diabetes, and duration. So these are the A, B, C, D2 score
Okay.
that can be easily applied in the ED, and you can calculate
Okay.
if the score is somewhere around between 6 or 7. So that is again, it's a high risk. So those group of patient, what literature shows that they have got 8% of chance of developing a stroke within the next 24 to 48 hours. So these are called high risk category TAA patients. So that is one thing that we can do. But again, you need to look in whether there is any underlying, because we are not considering the atrial fibrillation. We are not looking in the ABCD score doesn't have all those parameters. Suppose a patient with atrial fibrillation comes to you with a TAA and you're checking as an INR and that is suboptimal.
Okay.
So those group of patients are again high risk.
Okay.
Or already there is a diabetes, there is a previous history of stroke. Those group of patients are very high risk patients, but as per our experience, what we suggest, they should be inside the hospital. Those who are having a high score, they should be in hospital.
Okay.
But there are different guidelines. So when you look into the NIHS guidelines, because there again you can't admit all the patients coming to the ED. So what they suggest is that if the patient has gotten score of 6 or 7, the chance of getting a stroke is high, and they should be consulting a specialist neurologist within the next 24 hours.
Okay. Okay.
And that is their guidelines as such. But we can have our own practices. But what we practice, we keep them in hospital. That is because our system is different from that. We ask them to, because these are high risk TAA, we prefer them to be kept in hospital and start them on antiplatelets and do a detailed evaluation, because our specialist is easily available.
Okay.
But in a system where you need to wait a long for specialists to come, within 24 hours they should be having a specialist consultation.
Okay.
So those who are having less than 3 or 4,
Okay.
those category of people, maybe within 1 week they should go and meet their consultant neurologist. And all this group of patients should be started on an aspirin.
Okay.
So at the time of discharge from ED, you should start your aspirin.
Oh,
So what I am saying is that depending upon your availability of your specialist, and those high risk group of TAA
Okay.
patient, ideally, if possible, you admit them
Okay.
and get a specialist opinion where you have a neurologist or a stroke physician who is well versed in managing these sort of cases. Because TA is the area where we can miss. They can come back within the next 2 days with a severe stroke, which could have been prevented. Maybe at that time we need to go ahead with an evaluation of them, maybe an MRI with a full vessel study. What is the mechanism why he had a TAA? All those things can be evaluated when the patient is in hospital. And even if he develop a stroke within the hospital, he is within the window period, and there is a chance that we can immediately administer him thrombolytic therapy. So that 8% risk category, he is in front of you. He is inside the hospital itself. So those group of high risk TAA, you admit them and evaluate. So that will be my take on it.
I think Vivek sir can add on it. I think we should see TA as an opportunity to treat or prevent stroke, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but TIA, transient ischemic attack, is time for immediate attention. Like one thing is, when you get, in the public, we are medical people, but in the public, there is no situation where you got some illness, you are completely relieved of it, then you will not go to the hospital. So that's why we have increased the awareness of TIA in the society. Because TIA is a golden opportunity to prevent stroke.
Yeah.
And there are 2 types of TIA, apart from, as Dr. Srikrishnan told, there are the risk scoring and all. But one thing which you can remember, apart from that, is there are 2 types of TIA. One is speech or motor involvement in a TIA is high risk. Some people will come with numbness and tingling of one side and hand. They are sensory TIAs.
Okay.
Sensory TIAs are found to have less number of upcoming strokes. But in motor TIA, speech and motor TIA, there is a high risk of stroke. So these things are very important. And if the deficits last for more than 15 to 20 minutes, there is a high chance that not only clinical TIA, there can be some MRI infarctions. That is, it will be it's called minor stroke. Some of the minor strokes will have TIA-like symptoms, but they will go away. The compensation will happen immediately, but they will have marker of MRI damage of the brain, that is stroke. So they are called, so TIA and minor strokes are taken in the same thing. So then we have to definitely do vessel imaging, look for ECG, so echo and all basic things we have to do. So otherwise, the chance of a recurrent strokes are quite high.
Okay. I think that very much clears that question. Moving on to Girish sir. So another key concept in management of stroke is regarding recurrent strokes. If you can throw some light on what to look for in recurrent strokes.
We get a lot of cases with repeated attacks like a stroke or myocardial infarction. Wherever there is artery, that will be involved in some diseases.
Okay.
Like whether it is in brain or heart or kidney. Some diseases specifically attack the arteries.
Okay.
Like one of the common conditions in India and Kerala is diabetes.
Okay.
Uncontrolled diabetes is one of the cause for recurrent stroke.
Okay.
Because of the involvement of arteries. Again, hypertension, uncontrolled. All these things are uncontrolled. If you are hypertension or diabetes is well controlled,
Okay.
then the recurrent strokes or recurrent myocardial infarction chances are very less.
Okay.
So two important things: diabetes, hypertension.
Yeah.
Third condition is dyslipidemia. Dyslipidemia means again low HDL, high LDL, high triglycerides. All are risk for stroke and myocardial infarction. Again, tobacco smoking. Smoking is one of the most important cause for recurrent strokes in our country. So these are the modifiable condition, like we can by daily exercise or aspirin tablets, and we can modify this. So they are called as modified risk factors. Other condition which cannot be modified, they are genetical. Like patient who is having SLE or patient is having antiphospholipid syndrome, protein C, protein S deficiency. All these things are called as thrombotic states. They can present with other presentation, like they can have pulmonary embolism, pulmonary thrombus, or stroke, myocardial infarction. So many things can happen. One important condition is hyperhomocystinemia that can present as genetical problem or can be present in smoking also. So that is partly modified, partly cannot be modified. So many conditions which can present patient as recurrent stroke. One cardiac condition is atrial fibrillation. We already discussed in detail about atrial fibrillation. They also can present with recurrent strokes. So recurrent stroke require extensive investigation. Like in a routine stroke, like elderly individual coming with a one-time stroke means we are only checking his cholesterol or other parameters. But a young lady coming with repeated episodes of stroke or some other thrombotic event, we have to extensively investigate that patient for hyperthrombotic events. So that is very important.
Then another thing which I kind of came across when I was reading for this is the concept of cryptogenic stroke. That sounded kind of interesting. Can you just throw some light? What falls under this category?
Yeah, for anything in medicine, like we say cryptogenic means, crypto means it is cryptocurrency or whatever it is like. Crypto means hidden, it is hidden. So cryptocurrency is hidden, we do not know what currency it is. We invest money, we get money or lose money. So crypto means hidden. So when a stroke is investigated for the etiological mechanisms and they find that there is nothing wrong with the person, we would say it's a cryptogenic stroke. But about 22% of the strokes whom for those patients whom we have worked up a lot, like we do echo, we'll do Holter for occultative fibrillation, we do vasculitis, ANA profile, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, homocysteine levels, all these things are negative. They are known as cryptogenic strokes. However, depending upon the investigation capacity or investigating capacity of the institution and the physician profile, we would be able to identify the avoid the crypto in certain percentage. So that is what recent studies are showing. For example, so there was a study published in New England Journal of Medicine in 2015. That's called that was just looking into all the cryptogenic strokes. They were looked into several reasons, and once they have put a particular invasive heart rhythm monitoring device called Reveal XT. It's a small patch-like thing inserted into the chest, which is monitored the heart rate for 3-4 years, 3.5 years. They found that about 1/3 of these cryptogenic guys got atrial fibrillation. So atrial fibrillation is the most common cause of cryptogenic stroke. So there are attempts to give anticoagulation for cryptogenic strokes, presuming that atrial fibrillation could be one of the cause. So therefore, cryptogenic stroke will be cryptogenic stroke in some percentage, but depending upon our extent of investigation, many of the hidden things will come out. So cryptogenic stroke, but however, saying that there will be certain percentage of stroke will be always cryptogenic. So that is cryptogenic stroke.
I think that is a very interesting comparison with cryptocurrency also. Anyways, moving on to the next question to Girish sir. Like once we kind of common terminologies which we see in stroke diagnosis is regarding anterior circulation stroke, posterior circulation stroke, and lacunar stroke. These are most of the common kind of stroke diagnosis we are seeing. If you can throw some light on what these three things are and what are symptomatic and other variations with all these three.
When we go through clinical medicine, when we are practicing clinical medicine, these things are very important. But a stroke physician like Vivek sir, it's all same. He do a CT scan, whatever may be, he has to treat the patient. But for an MD student or an MBBS student, all these things are very important. Because if you see anterior circulation stroke or middle cerebral artery stroke or posterior circulation, there are clinical differences. So one of the most important, suppose we take MCA territory stroke. they can have hemiplegia, they
Okay.
can have altered behavior, they
Okay.
can have seizures,
Okay.
they can have some visual abnormalities, not complete visual abnormalities. If you take anterior cerebral artery, this one, that is not very common,
Yeah.
but they can have cortical visual loss.
Okay.
So that's one of the finding.
Okay.
But whereas we take posterior circulation stroke, this is very important because posterior circulation stroke clinically can present with, we have already discussed
Yeah.
stroke chameleons. They
Yeah.
can present like other features. Right? Somebody is coming with unsteadiness of gait, with some ringing noise in the ear. We may misdiagnose it as only ear problem. Sometimes it can be a posterior circulation stroke. And posterior circulation stroke is one condition where cranial nerves can be involved. Like if you take MCA territory stroke, they can have hemiplegia with UMN 7th cranial nerve palsy. But whereas in posterior circulation stroke in the brainstem or pons, midbrain, all these cranial nerves are there. They can be involved. So one side weakness, other side cranial nerve involvement. They are called as crossed hemiplegias.
Okay.
So that type of presentations can be there. So when we clinically examine these cases, we can understand where is the stroke. Exactly, we can pinpoint where is the lesion. But once we are taking CT or MRI, we know that where exactly is the lesion in CT or MRI. But Sir has told that CT is the one of the most important thing. We may miss the stroke sometime.
yeah.
So we will not be able to
The anatomical
pinpoint where is
location, yeah.
anatomical location according to CT.
Okay.
But if we know the clinical findings, we can correlate with the clinical finding with the CT. So we can probably make a diagnosis, this is MCA stroke. CT, even if the CT is normal, we can probably find out this is an MCA stroke. We can treat the patient.
Yeah.
So there is the advantage of knowing all these things. But for an MD student, it is very, very important for their exam point of view. Localization is very important in neurological cases.
Okay, okay. I think that made it very, very clear. Now we have kind of covered some of the major aspects of pathophysiology, clinical features, and diagnostic part, and we will just quickly move into the treatment part also. As you all know, the major line in treatment of acute stroke is regarding the thrombolysis, IV thrombolysis, which Krishna, can you just throw some light on what is the agent commonly used and how to use and when to use, and what are the major indications, so that you can set the ball rolling for the discussion.
Yeah. So again, the patient arrives in the ED. You have done your initial evaluation. You have found out that the NHS score. You have calculated NHS score, and he has come within the window period. So again, as Vivek sir said, really the wake-up strokes. So you have to definitely ask when was the time of onset, or when was the patient last seen well. So that is the time when we take the onset of symptoms, and you need to calculate whether they have come in within the window period. So one thing is that we can easily miss a stroke in the ED. So we have to be very vigilant when you are working in the ED. ED is a place where we can miss. Somebody has come to the ED and they will be saying that I had some tinnitus. Maybe by the time he is in the emergency department, his symptoms would have got worsened. Maybe we had evaluated him initially and we had checked he don't have any symptoms at that point, but suddenly he has developing stroke. So the most important thing, the time factor. Within the window period the patient is coming, don't leave from the patient, be with the patient and do your scoring system and alert your stroke team and make sure that the stroke pathway is activated. So that's the first thing. And you found out that you have went for a CT or MRI and whichever it is, and this candidate is fitting for thrombolysis. So the fitting for thrombolysis, again the most factor is the window period, and 3 hours, maybe extended window period to 4.5 hours. That is the first thing. And again there is no contraindications for your thrombolysis. So that is the next thing. So when the patients come to the ED, you have to, the most important, we will be looking into the vitals. The major contraindication will be hypertension. So initially the blood pressure, if it is above 185 by 110, that candidate is not an ideal candidate for thrombolysis, and we need to bring down the BP with whatever be the mechanism, whatever be the agents available, maybe labetalol or whatever the drugs available, you have to bring down the BP. That is one of the major contraindication, and there is a listed, long listed contraindications like previous history of hemorrhagic stroke, recent intracranial surgery, recent intra-abdominal surgery. These are all contraindication for thrombolysis. So if there is no contraindication for thrombolysis, immediately 20th minute the patient should be doing the imaging. So the patient has come to the ED and within 20 minutes the patient should be doing his imaging. And by the time
low to image time.
low to image time, that is the ideal thing that should be done. And in the CT room itself, adjacent to the CT room, you should be having your thrombolytic agent. That is the ideal scenario. So next to, you ship the patient next to the next room, where all the resuscitation facilities are available, all your monitoring facilities are available, your team is ready, and we need to, if the patient need to be catheterized, maybe a Ryle's tube insertion needed to be done, you have to do it before giving thrombolysis. So all those things you have to be very specific, and you have to have a clear stroke team where you should be avoiding any arterial punctures, and all those instructions should be clearly given to your team members. If they are trained in the team, they know about this, so there is no need of reinforcing it again. But if they are the team, we can just tell them what to be done. And you have to decide the drug of choice. There is no doubt what is the drug. It is the recombinant tissue plasminogen activator, Altiplase, what is available. That is the drug of choice. That is the approved US FDA. There are Tenecteplase is also getting approved. Maybe Vivek sir will be able to say his experience regarding Tenecteplase. But our experience is with tissue plasminogen activator. Again, you need to calculate the dose. 0.9 ml per kg is the 9 mg per kg is the dose that is required, and 10% of the dose has to be given as an IV bolus, and the rest as an infusion over 60 minutes.
Okay.
So during this period, the most important crucial factor is that we need to have a tight monitoring of the blood pressure. So maybe we will discuss the management of blood pressure. So at that time we will discuss the drug of choice is tissue plasminogen activator, 0.9 milligram per kg, maximum of 90 mg is the dosage, and it is available as 50 and 20 mg vials that is available. So you calculate and give the exact dose. So majority of the people, what they do is that they don't calculate the exact dose. They'll just give 50 mg, but the patient might require 65 or 70 mg. So you need to calculate the correct dose. Some people used to give half the dose also. That is all not correct. So when you are planning to give a thrombolytic agent, if there is no contraindication, the NIHS score is somewhere between 4 to 25, and there are no contraindication for your thrombolysis, go ahead with your thrombolysis and take all these standard precautions what I have mentioned regarding the arterial puncture, putting a Foley's catheter, all those things, and also you have to prevent the chances of the secondary brain damage like hypertension, hypotension, all those things, hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia, all those things has to be corrected also. Hypoxia, all those things should be taken into advantage. So the drug of choice is tissue plasminogen activator. Maybe Vivek sir can further.
The mainstay of treatment still remains IV thrombolysis.
IV thrombolysis.
So would you like to add something more on the IV thrombolysis part? And is there kind of any ceiling dose for IV thrombolytics or?
Yeah, like IV thrombolysis, basically there are several agents coming down now. Basically one is the Tenecteplase, as Dr. Sri Krishna was mentioning. TNK is a better modified version of a highly fibrin specific agent used for thrombolysis. And one of the advantages, since it's not a prodrug, so basically it can be directly injected, and that will save a lot of time. So that is one of the advantage of Tenecteplase. So there are sufficient data to show that Tenecteplase is almost as equally effective as the IV TPA. So maybe there is slight advantage for the timing part, because the TPA is given as a bolus followed by infusion of 1 hour or 1.5 hours. But in the Tenecteplase, it could be a bolus injection, which will in fact save the time, because it's just a bolus injection. So that is one of the advantages. So both can be used. I think the evidence for large vessel occlusions are more with TPA. It's a time tested drug. But TNK is coming up now. It is approved for medium vessel occlusions and all. Maybe it can be given also for large vessel occlusion, and now it is routinely practiced. Many physicians are giving Tenecteplase as a major first line thrombotic agent. But however, the standard evidence and better experience is with the TPA.
I think that kind of clears that part. But then, so I think over the last decade there has been a lot of importance coming up to the endovascular treatment in acute stroke. So if you can just tell us what is happening in that area, and what are the new changes and recommendations in terms of endovascular treatment? So
the endovascular treatment of stroke started way back in 1996-98. Because when people started thrombolysis, IV thrombolysis for myocardial infarction started in 1984. Subsequently, neurologists were also intrigued to start thrombolysis with medication. They started using streptokinase, which was the first drug used. Then they started using urokinase. And one of the first trial of thrombolysis for stroke, it was using streptokinase. But unfortunately, they compared streptokinase with plus heparin plus aspirin, everything in the patients with a placebo. So that is a bad trial, because all the patient bled. So, but if you look into the data of those patients, those who have not bled, they got very good improvement. So they, in fact, the concept was it is effective. So later they came with the other agents like streptokinase is highly non-specific fibrin, anti-fibrin agent.
Yeah.
So they came with this new drug. So subsequently, they started thinking of delivering this drug to the inside the vessel. That is why intra-arterial thrombolysis came. So they have used something called urokinase, pro-urokinase. That was a drug available that time.
Okay.
And so they came with the first trial called PROACT trial. So the PROACT trial was using pro-urokinase into the arteries when the time window is over, or when there is a large occlusion which is not responding to thrombolysis.
Okay.
But that journey has taken so many years to come with solid evidence, because up to 2013, even though PROACT trial, the first randomized trial, was a positive trial for endovascular thing, but subsequent trials were not very good. So they came with new agents and new devices for endovascular thrombectomy or endovascular treatment. So nowadays what FDA approved is called stent retrieval thrombectomy and aspiration thrombectomy. So the stent retrieval thrombectomy is deploying a stent into the thrombus which is blocking the metacerebral artery or basilar artery or other artery, and you deploy it, not completely, you keep the wire there and just pull it out through a guide catheter. So that will take the thrombus out, just hitching this thrombus inside the stent and pulling it out. That's called stent retrieval thrombectomy. And similarly, other thing is, if you use small catheters which will not collapse on suction, you can go and hit the catheter over the thrombus and you apply very good suction, so the thrombus whole thing will be aspirated. This is called aspiration thrombectomy.
Okay.
Sometimes people will use a combination of these two types of thrombectomy, like they use stent and they will use aspiration as well along with the stent. That's called Solumbra technique. And so many technical things have happened so that we got better results. And one thing you have to remember is endovascular thrombectomy in the right patient is a very good treatment, and the number needed to treat is 2.5. That means number needed to treat is a measure which gives the efficiency of the treatment if given to the correct patient. So like if you will be knowing, if you give aspirin to something like 35 patients only, you prevent one stroke. But if you treat endovascular patient treatment for 2.5 patients, one patient will have excellent outcome. That's a very good measure indicating the efficiency of the treatment.
Okay. And the window period for this intervention should be?
The window period for the intervention is actually, it is up to 6 hours usually. So if you want to deliver endovascular treatment to a patient, and if there's that usually will determine by doing a CT angiogram or MR angiogram, where you would see the occlusion of the blood vessel. If the blood vessel is occluded and the tissue is not fully damaged, as in the CT aspect or MRI diffusion or whatever it is, so you determine that this patient is a candidate for thrombectomy. So generally we would try to start the treatment less than 6 hours. So if it is not possible in 6 hours, then you have to do advanced imaging. So we really want to know whether any of the brain which is to be salvaged, that's called penumbra. So if the brain, I told about electrical failure, you want to save the brain which is having electrical failure without tissue necrosis, to bring it back to normal. So if there is evidence by any modality of imaging, there is sufficient brain remaining to save, or there is a penumbra to save, or there is a salvageable brain tissue, you can do thrombectomy up to 24 to 48 hours. But that is very exceptional cases. You should be very good in doing and determining the presence of salvageable tissue. If you do not have salvageable tissue, you will not do thrombectomy beyond 6 hours, even before 6 hours. So it is more likely to be a tissue window rather than a time window, because time is just a general arrangement, but if the tissue is salvageable, you can do thrombectomy at like 24 hours, 36 hours, whatever. So there are trials which are ongoing, which is they are trying to do thrombectomy at 24 to 48 hours also. So it is depending upon the capacity of the institution or the physician to identify the salvageable tissue.
Just one more question in the same terms. So is the endovascular treatment, are you seeing it moving forward as a standalone treatment, or is it going to be combined with always with an IV thrombolysis?
There are several trials ongoing, and as of now, with the evidence, we cannot avoid thrombolysis. Direct thrombectomy is not the standard of care right now. For indicated patients, we would do thrombolysis, and then we will take for thrombectomy. But there are trials which are showing certain trials. There is one Chinese trial which is released, which is showing non-inferiority of the non-inferiority means if you go direct thrombectomy, it is not inferior to IV thrombolysis plus the thrombectomy group.
Yeah.
So, but it is too early to say, because you have to understand one thing.
Yeah.
If your center is not able to do thrombectomy, you cannot refer directly for thrombectomy, because sometimes even thrombectomy is well said than done, because you need to get the cath lab, you need to get the physician to do it, and you need to get the access to the arteries. So thrombolysis is a simple treatment by giving an injection. So why do you want to avoid that standard of care, directly doing thrombectomy only? So sometimes even the best operator may not be able to take the thrombus out, but in those situations a thrombolysis could have worked. So we don't want to take away the chance of giving thrombolysis for the treatment. Thrombolysis still is the backbone of the stroke treatment.
And a vascular access after thrombolysis is not a concern at all.
Yeah, I mean, it was, even though we say a lot of contraindications, we used to puncture the femoral artery with the thrombolysis on flowing. So generally it's a sort of
Accepted
bleeding will
kind
be
of
there. Yeah, we will do that. There is no other way. It's a little bit risky thing. Your puncture should be good. Do not make too many punctures to the artery, so that there will be big hematoma, because the thrombolytic drug is going on.
In an experienced hand,
Yeah.
it should be done.
It will be okay. It should be okay.
Sure. Okay, I think that covers two major concepts and management of acute stroke, including the IV thrombolysis and the endovascular treatment. Grisha, but still our good old aspirins is a main line of treatment in acute stroke, right? So if you can just throw some light on the antiplatelet therapy in acute stroke.
So when we are talking about stroke in India, we have two types of setups. One is primary care setups, where we work in primary care hospital or just an hospital without any facility for thrombolysis. That is one type of hospital. Other types, we have facility for thrombolysis. All these things are available. In the primary setup, if we are working, it is always better to give aspirin and clopidogrel together. All these things are depending on the grading of stroke. Suppose somebody is having a very minor stroke, like lacunar infarct, clinically lacunar infarct, then one drug will be enough, like aspirin. We may start available aspirin is 300 milligram or 325 milligram. That can be initiated, then 150 milligram can be continued. How long to continue, that should be a question asked afterwards, because we cannot, at the point of time when we are diagnosing, we cannot predict how many days he has to continue, because we have to investigate the patient. But normally we start 300 milligram and continue 150 milligram in a minor stroke. Whereas somebody is having a severe stroke and we are not able to thrombolyze, aspirin with clopidogrel will be a better choice. So that can be continued as per the advice of stroke physician afterwards. But if we are working in a hospital where thrombolysis is available, and if the patient come in the correct time, like less than 4.5 hours, we can thrombolyze the patient. In that situation, better avoid aspirin and clopidogrel. Or if we are referring to a center where there is thrombolysis available and patient is still in golden hours, better to avoid aspirin and clopidogrel, because that may produce some problem for the physician who is treating the stroke. So that patient can be thrombolyzed, and after 24 hours we can initiate aspirin, clopidogrel, whatever drug the physician want, he can start. But whatever we tell, most of these cases, 90% of the cases in India may be coming to a primary care center. So if we don't have a good knowledge about aspirin, clopidogrel and statins, we may not start, because of fear of other problems like bleeding and all, we may not start. But it is always better to start aspirin, clopidogrel and statins, same like myocardial infarction. If we take all these things are vascular problems, so we have to prevent the platelet aggregation, propagation of thrombus. So aspirin, clopidogrel and statin will be a better choice in a primary care center. When the patient comes to a center where thrombolysis is available, it is always better not give immediately. But once the patient is thrombolyzed, we can initiate. But aspirin is still lasts many years. The role of aspirin has not changed, but the other drug which has changed from multiple drugs have come, but aspirin is still there. We can continue it. No need to worry about the bleeding problem because of aspirin. 150 milligram will never produce significant clinical bleeding.
Okay. Vivek sir, just extending that question, there was some interest regarding dipyridamole and all a few years back. I think that has fallen off now, or?
Yeah, like there are different type of antiplatelet agents, as Greer sir was mentioning. Like aspirin, we have aspirin and clopidogrel, and for clopidogrel, like we have several other derivatives also, like newer agents, like we have ticagrelor, we have prasugrel, all these things. But for stroke prevention, actually, simple aspirin and clopidogrel will be usually sufficient. However, saying that, there is new data in India that clopidogrel resistance, because clopidogrel is a prodrug, so it has to be converted to another active metabolite for action. So this conversion is happening to cytochrome P450 enzyme system, C23A4. So this system will be there are certain polymorphism in the system, so that this conversion will be much less compared to the normal population. In those population, there is a certain amount of clopidogrel resistance. And in the preliminary studies from India, and we also had a pilot data on this, on the aspirin resistance in the first ever ischemic stroke. We found that about 16% of the people with acute first ever ischemic stroke had aspirin resistance. Similarly, data from Belur and South India shows that there is about 20 to 22% of clopidogrel resistance. So in those situations, combining these agents will be an option. So, but we will not do that for a long time. But if the patient is undergoing carotid artery stenting or coronary artery stenting, there is a chance that the stent get clogged. So it will be wiser to get the clopidogrel resistance test. There is a test to check whether the patient is resistant to clopidogrel. That is called Verify Now assay. That's an available assay by package. So that assay can be done to look for patients who are under. So those patients who are having very risk stenting like aortic stenting or carotid stenting or intracranial stenting, those patients should not have clopidogrel resistance, because there's a high chance that stent get occluded. And those who are developing recurrent stroke, recurrent myocardial infarction as after the angioplasty, like primary PTCA or PTCA and stenting, we have to strongly consider clopidogrel resistance. Therefore, there is a new drug called ticagrelor, which is in the market, very commonly available. This drug has got less amount of clopidogrel resistance and would be a way forward for those with high risk for recurrent strokes.
All right, sir. Moving on to the last question regarding the management part, Krishna, if you can throw some light on the BP management in acute stroke. I think that's one area which people often miss it and things goes the wrong way. So if you can say how to manage BP in acute stroke.
Again, blood pressure management, we can just divide, we'll just leave out the hemorrhagic stroke as such. So we'll just take the ischemic stroke part. So those patients who are coming within window period and after window period. So those are not, we are not planning for any thrombolysis. So we will discuss that group first. So as you know, the sir has clearly described regarding the ischemic penumbra, what is exactly happening. So immediately we don't want to control the blood pressure if it is about 220 over 120. So if we are not planning for any thrombolysis or he has come with an ischemic stroke, we are not planning for an immediate intervention unless and until the blood pressure is about 220 or 120, or else we have other evidences of organ damage. Otherwise, we'll just keep to prevent that ischemic penumbra to have a good perfusion. We'll just wait and watch. Maybe even if he's a hypertensive patient also, maybe after the 24 to 48 hours, we will restart our antihypertensives. So that is the usual dictum. So those group of patients who has come after the window period, we are not planning for any thrombolysis. That is that group. So that is clear.
We allow a little higher BP.
With little higher BP and we restart their antihypertensive after 24 to 48 hours. So whatever they were on, we can restart, or depending upon the preference of the treating physician, he can decide upon the antihypertensive. Next category of patient who has come within window period, we are planning for thrombolysis. So before thrombolysis, as I mentioned before, 185 by 110 should be below, the blood pressure should be below 185 by 110. So labetalol is the agent of choice. So
I mean, both should, like 185, 110, both parameters, diastolic and systolic.
Diastolic and systolic. Diastole of 110 and systole of 185. The blood pressure should be less than that for your initiation of your thrombolysis. So initially you can give labetalol. If there is any other contraindication, we don't have any other IV agents. Previously we had hydralazine, but that is not available. But when you look into the literature, we have hydralazine, we have enalapril IV injection that is not available in India. So our agent of choice will be labetalol. Again, it has got a 1:7 action, alpha beta. So you have to look in terms of the bronchial asthma component. It is not a selective one. So bronchial asthma may be a relative contraindication for the use of your labetalol. In that scenario, we need to choose some other agent. Maybe a next line agent, what is available for us is nitroglycerin. So that is what is available for us. So 185 by 110, you give a bolus of 10 to 20 milligram of labetalol and see what is happening to the blood pressure. If you are getting the desired BP, go ahead with your thrombolysis. Once you have thrombolized the patient, your target of blood pressure should be less than 180 by 105.
Okay.
So that is your target. Again, labetalol is the agent of choice.
It
You
could be
can
either
give
a bolus or an infusion.
you can give a bolus, and if needed, you can give us an infusion 2 to 8 milligram per minute. You can give it and titrate to the BP. And once the thrombolysis is done, every 15 minutes for the first 2 hours, you should be monitoring the blood pressure. And for the next 6 hours, every 30 minutes, and hourly for the next 16 minutes. 16 hours, sorry. So that is the criteria. So if you are planning for thrombolysis, get the blood pressure below 185 by 110, then that candidate is fit for thrombolysis. There is no contraindication for thrombolysis. Once the blood pressure once the patient is thrombolysis, the blood pressure should be less than 180 by 105, and you need to monitor the blood pressure every 15 minutes for the initial hours, then every 30 minutes for the next 6 hours, and every hour for the next 16 hours. Then you can consider regarding your restarting your antihypertensive agent. Initially the preferred agents will be labetalol. So that is regarding your blood pressure management.
Okay. Just
In
extending
acute
that
ischemic
question to Vivek sir, is there a lower limit beyond which you are going to be worried, like post thrombolysis patient if the BP goes like really down or less than 140s, 130s? And
Yeah, it depends upon, there is something like when you drastically reduce the blood pressure after stroke, there are two things which can happen. One thing is in a patient whom we had given thrombolysis and there is a good recanalization, if you reduce the blood pressure drastically, it may not cause that much problem. But if the patient is not fully recanalized, that means the patient was not a candidate for endovascular treatment, patient has received thrombolysis but not able to get thrombectomy or not a successful thrombectomy. Here you should be careful. When we reduce drastically the blood pressure, the partially recanalized occlusion will be supported by umpteen number of collateral vessels from the leptomeningeal vessels. So if you drastically reduce that, it can happen something called collateral failure, which can make extensive infarction of the territory because of the less flow. So we should be careful. We can reduce, but however, we have to be careful that in the thrombolysis patient, there is always a risk of bleed. If the blood pressure exceeds and remains like that for hours, there is a chance that there can be hemorrhage.
Okay. Coming back to Krishna, one area I think there's a lot of emphasis in the Western world, but not much in India, is the pre-hospital care of stroke. If you can throw some light into that, it will be helpful.
Again, pre-hospital care, what I need to suggest is that identification of stroke. So you train all your paramedics, train all your healthcare providers regarding the pre-hospital care. So nothing much we can do in the ambulance or where they are bringing the patient. So the general public should be made aware that if they develop a symptoms of fast, again the mnemonic of fast you can remember. So this should be a mnemonic that should be available for all. All should be aware of this. And as doctors, we should be promoting more of health education activities for the patients and their bystanders so that they take the right place at the right time and they are not wasting any time by going to a center where they don't have facility for thrombolysis. So if they have any symptom, let them contact their first medical contact as early as possible. And as a pre-hospital care, there is nothing like we can give aspirin. It can be an hemorrhagic stroke. So there is nothing like if you have a chest pain, we can give aspirin and bring in the patient to the ED. But in a case of an acute stroke, we should have a very good EMS system, and the patient should be able to get an ambulance and he should be able to reach a center where he has got an excellent facility for all the stroke management, starting from a thrombolysis, imaging facility, thrombolysis, and maybe an endovascular treatment. Bare minimum, we can go ahead with thrombolysis facility. So if you look into the Cochin, maybe one of the center that Vivek sir has developed, one of our general hospital in Ernakulam as one of the centers for thrombolysis. With the help of our telemedicine facility, we have started thrombolysis and they are doing a very good job of doing thrombolysis in the center. They don't have an endovascular treatment strategy, but they are getting the patient on the right time, and the physician is very aware of what to be done, and with the help of our stroke department and Vivek sir, they are doing it very well in our general hospital. So that is just a small example that what I can quote. And what the basic pre-hospital things: early recognition of stroke and early reaching the hospital, correct hospital. That is the most important thing. You are reaching, you should be having that facility for the management of acute stroke.
Okay. Vivek sir, if you can just add on to that on the concept of telestrokes.
So of course, like the thrombolysis thrombolysis is just an intravenous injection, and only thing is that we have to identify the stroke and determine the eligibility for thrombolysis. So that is a tough area for the primary physician in the peripheral center. So sometimes they will see thrombolysis a patient, there will be a big bleed, that will cause loss of confidence to do further therapy because the drug is costly. the patient suffers a bleed and sometimes may die because it's a very dangerous bleed, usually thrombolytic bleed. So basically the question is to provide them the confidence and the capacity building for determining the eligible patient. So that can be helped by a stroke department or a stroke unit from a well-trained stroke neurologist can help him by seeing the images and the clinical scenario by either like video or by Zoom or whatever application which we use. So by this system we can help a lot of people to get thrombolysis at the right time, so that many people will be recovered. In the telestroke in the General Hospital Ernakulam and Palakkad and Idukki, so we were able to do a lot of thrombolysis. I think in the General Hospital itself we have thrombolyzed about 38 patients and there is no bleed at all. We have no complications because we are very choosy to do that because we don't want any more
Untoward
bleed.
events,
So young patients, you remember that young patients well within window, no other risk factor, no uncontrolled hypertension, they are very good candidates for thrombolytic agents. So if you identify them, look at the scan, make the eligibility right and then thrombolyze, they will have a very good functional outcome. So that's very important, but it needs a little bit of help for the primary physician. So telestroke would be useful. We can build up network of telestroke facilities just like in the US, where one network will be covering 1 or 2 states and they'll be working continuously on this and helping the people to thrombolyze and get back to function.
Okay, sir. Just to Krishna, suppose we have a very unstable stroke patient. So, is there anything specific we are going to concentrate on resuscitating a stroke patient and also regarding the rapid sequence intubation in a stroke patient also? Is there anything specific?
Yeah. So any resuscitation, we have to consider the hemodynamic status. That is the first thing that we need to consider. So what is the hemodynamic status of the patient?
Okay.
So we don't want any compromise on that. So whatever be the condition, that is our primary aim. But again, in case of stroke, that is the one of the most important things. So the agent selection should not be causing a profound hypotension.
Okay.
So once you have that profound hypertension, we are targeting a higher VP and we are using an agent which can cause a hypotension, then we are doing more harm than good for this patient. So you should have a clear-cut agent selection. So when you look into the rapid sequence intubation, so there are a lot of agents that is available. When you look into the best agent of choice, the usual reason why we wanted to intubate the patient. So that is the first thing. What will be the indication? The initial phase indication maybe he had a large hemorrhage. Or usually in ischemic stroke, if it is a massive infarct, that will be the time that when we need to decide, go ahead and intubate the patient to have the protective reflexes because it will be abolished. So we need to make sure that his airway is patent, we need to intubate. So at that point of time, we need to have a correct agent of choice. So we need to have the correct selection of agent. And the second phase will be, maybe he has got admitted into your ICU, maybe after 3-4 days, maybe he has developed an aspiration pneumonia and hypoxia will be the reason for your intubation. So the reason for intubation will be different, but whatever be the reason for intubation, your selection of agent should be appropriate that it will not cause an hemodynamic compromise, especially in the initial phase. Because acute stroke, when we are dealing with an acute stroke, we don't want any hypotension to be caused. So we can just think about the agents, what can be done. We can just go ahead and the first agent we can prefer is an etomidate. So etomidate is a very good agent in this aspect because it will not cause an hemodynamic compromise. So etomidate is an excellent agent. Only problem is that it can have some risk factors of myoclonus, but again when you combine with a smaller dose of midazolam, that is again abolished. So we haven't seen for the past 8 years we are left and right we are using etomidate. We haven't seen any myoclonus with major myoclonus with etomidate. So etomidate is a very hemodynamically stable agent that can be given with a combination of a smaller benzodiazepine. It will not have much effect. So that is one agent. When you clearly look into the etiology, propofol will be an excellent agent because it will decreases the cerebral requirement and it is a very good agent. But the problem is that it causes a significant hemodynamic compromise. So maybe a combination of ketamine with propofol. So ketamine, previously it was told that it will increase the intracranial pressure, but ketamine, now it has been clearly said, if there is any hemodynamic hypotension, the ketamine is a preferred agent of choice. Maybe you wanted to use propofol, you have to use a combination of propofol and ketamine, but what I will say, the preferred agent will be an etomidate will be agent of choice. Again, verse center, you don't have these agents. Previously, we can go ahead with even with a higher dose of fentanyl. But again, the problem with fentanyl is hypotension. So that is the one priority that we need to consider. So the drug selection, any time the drug selection should be very clear. So the hemodynamic status of the patient is the most important priority. And you have to prevent the secondary brain damage. So that is the most important aspect. So first of all, your hypotension should be avoided. Then you have to avoid any hypoxia and hypoglycemia. So that is again we will be checking for the HS that we all say the HS that we need to consider. So once you intubate, so you have to make sure that hypoxia is getting corrected. You are giving adequate ventilation, adequate air volume, whatever FiO2 is requiring, you are keeping it for the patient. So hypoxia, we should not have any amount of hypoxia, that should not be permitted. And again, we need to avoid any hypoglycemia. And at time of resuscitation, the most important point is that you have to scopy has to be as gentle as possible. You should not be doing a scopy that is again increasing your intracranial pressure.
Okay.
So again, the role of atropine when you ask to abolish the airway reflexes, previously it was considered, but once you have a very good sedative agents, very good induction agents like etomidate and midazolam, and you are selecting a very good paralytic agents like either
Even
like a
lidocaine was
rocuronium,
kind of-
lidocaine or a succinylcholine.
Yeah.
Lidocaine has been tried,
yeah.
but routinely it is not needed. But we can give a trial of lidocaine if you are very concerned about the raised ICP and to abolish that reflux. Lidocaine can also be tried. So that is regarding your drug selection, and you have to be as gentle as possible. And the next important thing is that we have to avoid tying it over the neck veins. So once you are fixing the endotracheal tube, we need to avoid tying. The usual thing is that we will tie it over the carotids, and the jugular vein will get compressed. As a result, again the ICP will increase. So best thing will be to tape, or you have adhesive bandages available. So avoid compression of your carotids. Maybe you are planning an EJV and all, it will be better to avoid it over this area. So that will again raise the blood pressure. And post intubation again 30 to 45 degree reclination will be again ideal. So to decrease the intracranial pressure, there are 3-tier system that we generally follow to decrease the intracranial pressure. So the basic dictum like bed end elevation, avoid compression over your jugular veins. Then you can give milder sedative agents, and if needed, you can go ahead with the deeper sedative agents. And finally, if the patient needs a decompressive surgery, you need to go ahead with the initial phase. So that will be the resuscitation path that we have discussed for acute stroke.
Okay. Again, thank you all the audience for staying and continuing to watch the program, and please feel free to ask your questions. Whatever has not been answered in the course of the discussion will be taken up at the end of the session. And we are moving towards the last few questions. Coming to Girish sir. Sir, we have already mentioned about AF and stroke. Now, what are the key things to remember in management of AF in acute stroke? Like,
So when we are practicing in emergency room, we have to think about AF first, because we are mainly following ACLS protocols in emergency room. Somebody coming with rapid heart rate, which is irregular, so it will go to a narrow complex irregular tachycardia. That management has to be done. So somebody is having atrial fibrillation with high BP, like Sri Krishnan told, we can start labetalol in stroke. So that may be enough for that, even that controlling the rate. That beta blocker may be enough. If the patient is having hypertension, then we have to go for shocking the patient, or hypertension or coronary artery disease. That according to ACLS protocol, we will be doing that part. But main thing is atrial fibrillation is there, stroke has developed. Now, if we want to investigate the patient, like investigation is one part, treatment is another part. Want to investigate the patient who is having atrial fibrillation and developed a stroke, whether it is an acute stroke or a recurrent stroke, we have to do a transesophageal echo. Rather than doing a routine echo, TEE will be a better investigation of choice in that type of case, because we can pick up the thrombus there. So that will be the investigation of choice. Other part of atrial fibrillation investigation will be simultaneously we are doing, whether hyperthyroid state is there or some other reason for atrial fibrillation. That all part will be going simultaneously going on. And somebody is having atrial fibrillation and developed stroke. He has come in a window period that less than 4.5 hours in a center where there is capability of thrombolysis. It's always better to take the patient for thrombolysis with the help of the stroke physician, because he is an expert that. Because this is a complicated case. This should not be managed by only emergency physician. You need a teamwork there. So stroke physician should be involved first itself. So this patient can go for thrombolysis. Suppose we are not able to thrombolyze or thrombolysis is over, this patient can develop again stroke because of this atrial fibrillation, mural thrombus that is dislodging the thrombus to brain. So that is again possible. In that case, we have to start warfarin.
Okay.
Normally, warfarin will take some time to act, like 7 days. But in stroke, unfortunately, heparin is not an indicated drug in acute stroke. Whereas in a chronic stroke, you can start your heparin and wait for the warfarin to act. You can do like that. But routinely, we thrombolize the patient, then we can start the warfarin, keep the INR between somewhere between 2 to 3. But what we are routinely seeing is patient who is having atrial fibrillation, they come with recurrent stroke. When we check the INR, it may be suboptimal, maybe 1.2, 1.5, like that. Most of the patients are not taking warfarin either properly or due to some reason, like even interaction can be there. The INR is not going to that optimal level, so that should be corrected. So warfarin can be started. Should be very careful when we are starting warfarin. Keep the INR only in that therapeutic range. If it is going high, we know that it can produce bleeding. If it is going less, again patient can have lot of complication. There are other drugs, they are not very superior to warfarin, but their side effect profile, if you take the side effect profile, they are better than warfarin. But cost wise, warfarin is better than drugs like apixaban, rivaroxaban. All these things are side effect profile, they are in a better way than warfarin. But if you take the large population, most of them are on warfarin. Should be very careful when we are starting warfarin. We should advise the patient to, whenever a doctor is starting a new drug, always check the interaction with warfarin. That is very, very important in atrial fibrillation or whatever condition we are starting warfarin. So warfarin is the main drug, should be started, but according to stroke physician's guidance, we have to titrate the dose.
Okay, sir. Coming to Vivek, sir. Sir, there is definitely some role for decompressive craniectomy in management of malignant strokes, right? So, if you can emphasize on the real timing and indication and what is the basic outcomes on decompressive craniectomy?
Decompressive craniectomy is it's a desperate measure actually when our acute stroke treatment was not effective or somehow some unfortunate patients will have massive infarction. So when there is an indication that this massive infarction is going to swell up very badly so that it will compress the brainstem and cause cause damage to the life or damage to the brainstem. So we would definitely plan the decompressive craniectomy. So the one thing which we have to remember is if you are planning to do decompression, do it early. Because one of the things which usually to happen is we would wait for the patient to deteriorate and then we will try to do thrombectomy, the decompressive craniectomy, hemicraniectomy. So if we are planning to do hemicraniectomy, if the stroke physician or the team is feeling that this patient is going to go for herniation and malignant swelling, early indications should be picked up and immediately patient should be decompressed. Again, I would reiterate the point here that time is brain for decompression also. Like if you are doing hemicraniectomy, do it at earliest. Do not wait for the patient's pupil to dilate and then do decompression. The outcome will be very bad. So decompressive craniectomy is a life-saving, not only life-saving procedure, it is also morbidity-saving procedure if we are doing it in a correct time. So do it early. If you see a large infarction and patient is doing okay, still if there is slight deterioration in the sensorium, that is a more sensitive thing, and slight change in the responsiveness of the pupil, that is where they are to be monitored in a stroke ICU with the trained nurses or residents or people who are able to identify the subtle changes in the pupil response. But the early changes when there is swelling, the pupil will start reacting a little bit sluggishly compared to the opposite side. The moment you have to call the neurosurgeon and we have to plan decompression within like 2 to 3 hours, and that will be the best time to do decompression.
I think the timing is the key factor there, right, sir? One more question to you, sir. We have discussed it regarding the imaging part, but can you explain regarding the imaging of the vascular part? So the vascular imaging in terms of Dopplers and angios and DSAs.
Yeah, of course. Like if you look into the acute stroke imaging, it's very important to know the structure of the vessel because we are basically stroke interventionalists or plumbers. We make this pipelines which are wrong, we'll try to make it right either by coiling or stenting, whatever, or thrombectomy. So basically we have to know the pumps, how the pumps or pipes are doing. So basically the pipes, the thing is, the best thing to do angiogram is a CT angiogram. Only problem we require contrast for it. MR angiogram can be done without contrast. They are reasonably okay without contrast. and Doppler will give the neck vessels only. So
Okay.
if you do a protocol, we have to involve both brain and neck vessels so that we can have a better idea of the vascular state of the brain.
Right. Moving on to the last question, sir. Sir, I'm sure there's a lot of students also listening to us. So, if you can just tell us what are the 3 or important trials results you have to be aware of regarding the management of stroke of late. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know whether what's the importance of trials, but thing is nowadays we are going to evidence-based medicine. We are going like you cannot do. That is our modern medicine is different from other systems. So they got some book. It is told, it is done. So we'll be doing for generations. But in modern medicine, if we are not giving every stroke now mannitol. I'm sure that you may think you will give mannitol for every stroke patient. That is not practice now because previously people used to give it. Now we are not giving it because we learn from our own evidence. So we make continuously making efforts to modify the medicine. That is why we are in modern medicine and we are proud of it, right? So evidence is something which you look into trials and look whether the benefit of a particular treatment is due to chance or like some patients used to say I have treated 10 patients, I will do the 11 patients so that I will do next patient, but that may not be correct. That's why we need evidence. So some of the evidences, I told you about the endovascular treatment of stroke and it took about 20 years to prove it by evidence. Now the evidence is there. So I would say the most important trials which are really they have made change is actually the endovascular trials, mainly the MR Clean trial, which is a trial which is done in the Dutch by the Dutch people by doing only thrombolysis and thrombolysis with thrombectomy for patients. And in the Canada, we have done the ESCAPE trial, which is another trial where they have looked into people comparing the endovascular treatment with thrombolysis and only thrombolysis. These trials together taken, there was solid evidence that the thrombectomy treatment is very effective for patients with a large vessel occlusion. I think in these last 2 decades, the most important trials are the endovascular trials, mainly the MR Clean trial, ESCAPE trial, and an array of trials. And also recently we have 2 trials which have looked into the late thrombectomy, like diffuse and DONE trial. So these trials are actually looked into the, as I have mentioned, sometimes we will do thrombectomy beyond 6 hours, but however, in those patients, we would be trying to identify the salvageable brain tissue. So those trials are also important. These are because they allowed us to do thrombectomy up to 24 hours in selected patients. Don't think that all patients will have thrombectomy up to 24 hours. No, we will do thrombectomy only up to 6 hours. But those patients who had evident salvageable tissue with MR perfusion or CT perfusion scans, it is proved that they have a better outcome. So those 2 trials, one is the basic endovascular trials, other is the trial for extended thrombectomy beyond 6-hour window. These are the major landmark trials which really have created change in the management of acute ischemic stroke. Apart from that, we have the new medications, as Girish sir was mentioning about the atrial fibrillation. So we have new group of trials where they have tried the newer oral anticoagulants, and they are really game changers. Because we used to give warfarin, we used to see warfarin hemorrhages due to the uncontrolled INR and PT. It's very difficult to control in some patients, and we used to, for those patients, it's a big relief and it's a really game changer, so that many patients whom there is atrial fibrillation, physicians not used to treat with warfarin because of fear of bleed. There is always an inherent fear of bleed. But after the arrival of these newer oral anticoagulants, there is a sea change in the paradigm of management of the atrial fibrillation and stroke prevention. So there are several trials which have looked into the different agents. Like first trial is the RELIDE trial, looked into dabigatran. It's a direct thrombin inhibitor for prevention of stroke in patients. And then we have apixaban, what is called Aristotle trial. We have rivaroxaban, Rocket AF trial. These 3 were the cardinal trials which really proved that these agents are either non-inferior or superior to conventional warfarin therapy. I think these 2 trials made, and there is one more trial where the one confusion which you may get is you see a TI in the emergency and you want to give antiplatelets to them. So you are worried whether shall we give aspirin and clopidogrel or only aspirin, only clopidogrel, or load with both or not load with. These are the common questions which physicians face, and they really ask themselves and ask somebody else what to do. But we have certain answers in a trial called CHANCE trial. And that is actually a Chinese trial which they have given 2 antiplatelets for a period of 3 to 4 weeks, and they found out that the recurrent stroke risk is much less in the people in the patients whom they have given 2 antiplatelets. So for this, after this trial, there is a change in practice that up to 4 to 6 weeks we can give double antiplatelets in TIA patients. But long duration antiplatelet therapy is ongoing. We do not know what is the answer for that.
Okay, thank you, sir. That was really comprehensive. With that, we have come to the end of our pre-planned questions, and I thank once again all the audience who have stayed back and shot some questions for us. We'll try to go through the questions and we'll take up what has not been discussed in the course of the discussion. Krishna, you can also have a look because I had some net connectivity issues. We are starting with a lot of thank you comments and good mornings.
Can stroke cause myoclonic dystonia? There is one
from Rahul.
Rahul P.
Yeah, like myoclonic dystonia. So I think myoclonic dystonia is a it's a different scenario, but I think it can cause. It's not an acute phase. Since we are discussing about the acute stroke, I think we may restrict ourselves to acute stroke.
Yeah.
But saying that some of the infarctions in the basal ganglia and caudate nucleus can cause a myoclonic dystonia in the future. So we used to see people with unusual tremors. That's what I mean. That is what that Dr. Rahul mean. Like there will be certain patients months after the stroke coming with a little bit tilted head and a little bit of or a tilted hand with a lot of tremors. So that is actually because there will be tremor and dystonia together. So I don't think it's very rare to have, but it can get as a long-term sequelae. But myoclonic dystonia itself is a different entity which requires discussion in another form.
Yeah, Praveen Prasad was asking, is physiotherapy and physical rehabilitation? Of course, it has a major role to play, but since we are restricting our discussion to acute stroke, we didn't go into it. Yes, it has a major role, physiotherapy and physical rehabilitation. How to localize lesion in brief, I think that would be an extensive class in itself. I think we'll come up with a video on that in due course. Anjit is asking, is mannitol contraindicated in brain herniation and patient is in hypertension? Okay, so you just mentioned about
I think mannitol is a costly drug. It's a drug with a lot of toxicity. Like means in the that the veins get thrombosed. We will give mannitol only one situation where you are waiting for a decompression. There's a massive infarction. Especially in the mid-cerebral artery territory, there is a large infarction, and you call the neurosurgeon, and neurosurgeon is on the way or is a little bit late. In those situations, you can give load with mannitol, and it's just interim treatment for before decompression.
It's a rescue drug rather than preventive drug.
It's not like previously we used to give a lot of mannitol. Like every order in the stroke patient, there will be injection mannitol 100 milligram IV ethanol. But you have to understand it will cause dehydration, osmotic diuresis, hyponatremia, and also thrombophlebitis, significant thrombophlebitis. So I think we have to avoid and we have to restrict this use of drug only as in really when there is a situation of edema and before going to decompression. Only situation we have to use mannitol is those situations.
Okay, Patel has a question on CT and MRI. I think we discussed it in detail. Again, there is a request for localization of lesion, which we will come up with. TIA, yes, we have answered from Dr. Soumya. We have sensory and motor. When to take CT scan and when to take MRI scan, we have already discussed that.
Role of hypertonic. What is it? We have.
Stroke. Yeah, TIA and stroke, I think Krishna explained in detail. Thanks, Google, for that question. Shankar Narayanan, posterior circulation, gait, and cranial nerve involvement. I think we covered that also.
Yes.
Shankar Narayanan asked about disadvantages of tenect replace. Anything specific, sir?
Yeah, I mean, disadvantages. Actually, we do not have any obvious disadvantage of tenect replace. But I think the data for tenect replace for large vessel occlusion is not that robust. That is the only issue. But I think in the future data will come, and now we have approval for like whatever trials we have done was for the medium-sized vessels. Nowadays they are using for large vessels also. Practically we are using it. We do not find any significant disadvantage. What myself I have found that we used tenecteplase in Kerala first time as a series because we have availability problem with the TPA here. So that time we found that it's about 45-46% of recolonization.
Okay.
It is given by the tenecteplase. It's not bad. It's almost equal to the TPA.
Okay.
So I think there is no obvious disadvantage, but only thing we may wait for some more evidence for especially for large artery occlusions. Medium vessel, large vessel, it is medium vessel, small vessel, absolutely it is good.
Okay. So Somashekar was asking hemorrhagic conversion of ischemic stroke and when to start aspirin. So
Yes, it's a good question. Hemorrhagic conversion. Then in hemorrhagic conversion of stroke is there are several types of hemorrhagic conversion. So as per the classification, the trial like what ECAS2 trial. So there is a classification for hemorrhagic conversion of stroke like there is HT1, HT2, PH1 and PH2. HT1 as any stroke if you recolonize, even if you don't do thrombolysis, there can be spontaneous recolonization, small specks of blood in the CT that is called HT1 or small pinprick areas of blood or hyperintensity. So that is HT1. HT2 is actually multiple areas of confluent areas of little bit of white patches in the CT. That is called HT2. In these situations, you can very well start aspirin. There is no problem. It will not cause much bleeding. But when if you have thrombolyzed a patient and sometimes you are given heparin or something, the infarcted area can show a large hemorrhagic portion with like diffuse bleed, which is less than 1/3 of the whole infarct size. So that's called PH1. I think in PH1 and PH2, it will be better to wait.
okay.
You do the CT scan after 2 to 3 days and see that that hemorrhage is resolving. Then you can start antiplatelets. So otherwise, sometimes there can be leak. And if the MCA territory, the leak can go to the ventricle and can cause hydrocephalus, then things will worsen. Even though usual cases it will not happen. So it will be safer to start antiplatelets after documenting that existing hemorrhagic transformation, especially the PH1 and PH2. PH2 you cannot start at all. PH2 is very bad bleed with a big hemorrhage and a lot of swelling. So there you cannot start. So PH1 you should be careful. HT1 and HT2 you can start.
Okay, clear. There is another question like, is there any way to identify hemorrhagic and ischemic stroke at primary care center? I mean, probably he's looking like without imaging kind of.
Yeah, like some. Yeah, I mean, this is often people used to ask this, but one thing there is clinically you can usually you can detect. One thing is, if the deficits are progressing gradually. For example, if you got somebody with a small facial deviation to begin with, and over 15 to 20 minutes, every minute it is progressing and going bad and bad, it is more likely to be hemorrhage. And presence of headache definitely points to hemorrhage. But nonetheless, some of the people will ischemic stroke with occlusion can have, because large infarction, they can have a headache. So headache may not be exclusive to the hemorrhage, but progression of the deficits in a peculiar way, like over hours, very severe deficit is a sign of hemorrhage rather than. So, but we don't depend completely on clinical for any treatment decisions.
Yeah. Rahul was asking there is an update on AHA guidelines and can be discussed. I think Rahul, we have just covered it based upon whatever is the recent information available, and though we didn't mention specifically about the name, whatever we have recommended is based upon the newer guidelines. And AHA had, as we have come up with an endovascular intervention guideline also, which also we kind of touched upon. Yeah, there is some request for a Telegram group and all. I think yeah. I think how to give. I think struggles. There's some question regarding dual antiplatelets. I think we've covered everything. Yeah. Mannitol, I think we covered.
Then again, there was a question with Coccus-Cushing reflex. I think the bradycardia with hypertension.
Yeah.
That is a classical Coccus-Cushing reflex.
So what's the question?
The raised ICP. So
Cushing
how
reflex.
to manage? So we have to manage the raised ICP.
Yeah, I think that's it. Krishna, anything else I missed?
No, I'm just going through.
Yeah.
Mannitol, if it's hemorrhagic diagnosis. Yeah, I think we have covered.
Yeah.
You can.
I think as you know, stroke itself is a specialty and it's not possible to cover everything, but I think we tried our best to cover the key salient features in terms of both the exam preparation kind of scenario and also on a clinical management kind of scenario. And once again, I thank all our panelists and also the audience who stayed back with us and have your question. Definitely this video will be uploaded in our
Today
channel.
evening
Today evening. Yeah.
or by tonight we will try.
Okay, okay. Again, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
See you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appa.